Hey, welcome to Squarebody Stuff. I am Chad. We've got Cream Puff in the shop this time, and Cream Puff is in need of some ball joints. So we've got upper and lower ball joints for both sides, and I will show you how to do that here in just a minute. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you, if you like what you see here, hit that subscribe button down below. Ring that little bell next to it. That'll give you notifications of whenever I put a new video out. I try to do about 2 a week. While you're down there, in the description box below, there's also a link to my Teespring store where you can check out my merchandise. There's links to my email, Facebook, and Instagram. So click on those, give me a shout there. Also, make sure you give me a thumbs up if you like what you see, because that helps the channel out. Now, we'll get to jacking this truck up and get some ball joints put on it. There's a couple indicators that you might have some bad ball joints. One of them is the inside of your tires wearing uneven than the outside, because when the ball joints go bad, your tires kind of go like this. And also, if they're loose enough, it can also cause it to toe out just a little bit, compounding the tire wear problem. The best way to check the ball joints is only jack up one side at a time so your vehicle doesn't rock, and only get it a couple inches off the ground. Get a pry bar underneath there, and you can see how much wear is in that. That's pretty bad. Really not safe to drive. And reaching back, if you're by yourself, you may have to reach around the back and kind of put your hand on everything and move it to see what part's moving. But I'm going to go ahead and do upper and lower ball joints. That way they're on both sides. That way they're all good. I know they're all good. And I even got the good ones. I got the Moogs this time. Actually, I just put upper ball joints in this truck about 1.5 years ago. And of course, they were the cheap ones, and they didn't last. So I'm going to put the good ones in there, or better ones, and hopefully they'll last a little bit longer. As you can see, I've got the jack stands underneath the frame. That way I'll have plenty of room to work the suspension with the jack whenever I go to take the ball joints out, because I need to hold the upper or the lower control arm up with the jack while you take the ball joints loose, and then slowly let it down. So I put it underneath the frame to give me full range of motion and working room for my suspension. Hopefully you can see that in camera how much the inner part of the tires wore. I really need to replace these, but that's not going to happen right now. I've got to figure out what kind of size tires I want to put on there, because these were just some used ones I threw on. They're not the size I really want. They're 235, 75 15s. I'm kind of thinking about going with a 255 or 265, a little bit wider on the front. But one thing I want to make note of is go ahead and unlock your steering wheel. Just turn it to the first click so your steering wheel will move. That way, if you need to, you can move your steering knuckle around underneath here. You can unhook your battery too, that way you don't drain the battery down if you have accessories on or something. But usually if you put it on the first click, you'll be alright. Now, the next step is to get the brake caliper off. Now, I'll use a screwdriver and put it in the top here. I'm not going to show it because I think I've got it on another video of actually doing brakes on these. So if you want to get more detail on brakes, removing the caliper, you can go to that video. I'll put a link up in the corner here to it if I can remember when I edit the video. You just pry it loose to where it'll come off the rotor a little easier. Then you just got the 2 Allen screws, your through bolts, your mounting bolts, whatever you want to call them. Hold your caliper in, and always make sure that when you take your caliper loose, don't let it hang off of your hose, because you can actually rupture the inner line of the hose, separate or something. And so always wire it up out of the way with either zip ties or some welding wire, whatever you want to do. Now, the next thing we'll do is get these cotter pins out. And I usually use a pair of side cutters for cotter pins. Just one little trick. You can also use some needle nose, but side cutters, usually you can kind of grab a hold of it and more or less pry it out. Don't put too much pressure and cut it, because then you don't have anything to grab a hold of. And you won't be reusing those, so it doesn't really matter. The best way to do it is get them bent up somewhat flat. Makes it a little easier to get them out if you can. If yours are seized in there, like I said, these have been replaced not too long ago, so everything's fairly easy to take apart. Nothing's rusted solid. But if yours are stuck in there, I have before just cut them off flush with the nut and just got my socket on there, wrench, and just spun it off. Usually it'll just chew that cotter pin off. Alright, there's that one. Alright, if you've noticed, I've got a little background noise. It's been raining, so we'll get a lot of noise from the tin roof. I'm actually trying to film in between rain showers. I think it's about to quit now, so I can kind of get on with this project. Now our next step is to get these nuts broke loose, and it really doesn't matter which one you start with. If you're doing upper and lower, like we're doing here, you can get them both broke loose. And I like to go ahead and run it most of the way off. That way you know the threads are clean. Now if you happen to break this nut loose and it pops down, if the lower ball joint goes ahead and releases, you'll need to stop and go ahead and get your jack underneath your A-arm. That way because you're under the spring pressure right now. Same thing goes for the upper, because it may pop loose on you before you really want to. You don't want to take the nut all the way off. Just kind of run it to where you get to the end of the threads where these little notches are in the castle nut, and then run it back up in there. That way it's not going to go anywhere. Now at this point, I'll go ahead and get my jack underneath here, and I'll break the upper ball joint loose, and then I'll work on getting the lower ball joint loose. Now actually, as I was wheeling the jack around here to get into position, I heard a pop, and this upper one had already broke loose because it's got a taper inside that knuckle. Now I just got to worry about breaking the lower one loose, and they could be a pain. Now as you can see, I've got my jack out towards the end. That way when this breaks loose, I'll get it up there a little bit to where it's really close. That way when this breaks loose, it's still trapped. It's not going to go anywhere, because if you were to break this loose and this one wasn't captured or anything, then it would just spring out. That spring could fly out. It could be a very dangerous situation. So you want to keep your nuts on there, keep everything kind of trapped while you're breaking this loose. And you need to get a pickle fork. That's what I call them. Ball joint separator, tie rod separator. Sometimes it works, sometimes it don't. Actually on these they don't work too good because there's almost too much space in between there. A lot of times if you just hit it just right with the hammer, it will bust loose. And sometimes you got to get a bigger hammer. And there it went. Finally broke loose. Now, they could just be a pain. You have to beat on them. If you're worried about hurting anything, then I'm not really sure what to tell you. This is just kind of how I've always done it. any means necessary to get it loose. Now both of our nuts are loose, or both of our ball joints are loose. We can put a little pressure on it now. Now at this point, this is where things can become really dangerous, because there's nothing keeping that spring. If the pressure drops, if your jack slips, there's nothing to keep that spring from flying out. Now if you've got a sway bar on the front like I do, that should help, because it connects it over to the other A-arm. That should help keep it from relieving all the pressure, but it's still, and your shock is going to hold it so far. So right now I'm just going to let the jack down easy and see what happens. So right now, as you can see, my spring's still got tension on it. It's not loose, but I'm bottomed out on my shock. It's not going to go anywhere, I don't think. I feel really safe with what we got going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and get my jack out of the way, because we'll need to get our ball joint press on this lower ball joint. I'm going to go ahead and start on the upper ball joint. Now, as you can see, this one's got bolts with nuts. If this was the factory original, it would have rivets. Kind of wish it did have the rivets so I could show you that, but the best way to get the rivets out is actually take a grinder, grind them flush to where you can just drive them through. That's the easiest way to get the rivets out. Usually not that big of a deal. They can be a pain in the butt, but unfortunately I don't have the way to show you that. But to replace this one, just take these bolts loose. Once you get your bolts loose, your grease cup will come off. And then your ball joint will come out. And that thing's just very loose. Now you want to clean all this up real good. Make sure everything's, make sure your holes are not got any boogers if you had to push the rivets out or anything. So I'll get the new one in if I get it cleaned up. Now I'm a big fan of putting anti-seize on everything. That way it makes it easier for the next guy or yourself the next time you work on something. I'll go ahead and put a little anti-seize in all my bolts. Go ahead and get your ball joint set down on there. Get your grease cup started, and you can get a bolt up through there. I'm going to go ahead and torque these down. If you don't have a torque wrench, just get them good and tight. You don't want to overstress them. These are just 5/16 bolts. This one came with grade 8 bolts. The instructions say around 20 foot-pounds or pound-feet. But actually I looked it up. A grade 8 5/16 bolt should be torqued down about 30 to 32 pound-feet. So I'm going to go with 30 just to be on the safe side. I'm not sure the old one, they were just grade 5 bolts on the old one. Cheap, a little cheaper ball joint, but this one comes with the good ones. So I'll go ahead and get these torqued down. And you'll want to tighten them in a crisscross pattern. Now you don't want to forget your grease zerk. Most of the time they're not threaded, so you have to take your time and make your own threads. Don't want to over tighten it and snap it off, and then you got a whole nother mess on your hands. Now if you're just doing your upper ball joint, you could have left your steering knuckle on this bottom one, a bit kind of in the way, but it's doable. And then at this point, then you just put it back together and be on your merry way. But since we're doing both, I'm going to put my nut and cotter pin in my little tub here and start working on this lower one. Now we're fixing to have some fun. This lower one may or may not be a royal pain in the back end. First you want to pry your grease cup off. I'll get this scraped and cleaned up, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now to do the lower ball joints, you'll have to have a ball joint press. You can actually usually rent these from your local parts or auto parts store. This one's just a cheap one from Harbor Freight. It's had a lot of use. It's kind of bent up a little bit, but it still does the job. In order to get my ball joint press on there right, I had to jack up my A-arm with the jack so it's suspended a little bit. You just got to make sure everything's still fairly stable. Don't go jerking on anything. Most times these press out fairly easy. I've already got it kind of started. I still don't have a whole lot of room under here. And honestly, you can actually most of the time just hit these with a hammer, move that back and forth and smack it with a hammer on each side. Just keep working and they'll come out. But I want to show you how to use this press. Now if your ball joint press has different adapters and is straight, it'll probably look a lot better, but I'm just working with what I've got, and that's that. Now this lower one wasn't in that bad a shape. There wasn't a whole lot of play in it. I think my lower one on the other side is in rough shape. I was working on it earlier in between rain showers when I couldn't record because it's too loud in here, so I started working on the driver's side, and it's actually this is actually pulled out. When I was trying to separate it, it actually pulled up, so it's the lower ball joint on that side was about to come apart. This one still seems okay, but I'm gonna go ahead and replace it. I'm gonna take a wire brush, clean out this hole, get some anti-seize in there, and I'll anti-seize up the other ball joint, and we'll work on getting it pressed back in. I got it all anti-seized up, and what I've done is I've just got it up in there and kind of tapped it. Don't want to get too carried away with that, but just tapped it to get it kind of set in place. That way I can set up all my junk here to get it pressed back up in there. So I'm going to get everything set back up and start pressing it back in. Now the hardest part for me right now is going to be getting this pressed in nice and even, because of my press is kind of sprung a little bit. But mainly as long as this is pushing up even in here, we'll be okay. Alright, I've got it pressed in. Like I said, I had to kind of work it around. You just got to make sure that once you get it up in there, that look underneath and make sure you don't have a gap on one side or the other. And that's pretty much all there is to installing the lower ball joint, other than just putting everything back together. Make sure you put your cup back on there. Now it's just a matter of anti-seizing the snot out of everything. Put the lower one on. Get my new nut for the lower one. Let's go ahead and get it started on there. It doesn't need to be tight yet. And I won't put my greaser in it until later, because I want to be jacking up underneath there and I don't want to mess up my grease fitting, whatever you want to call them. And of course I got a bunch of dirt all over my upper ball joints. I have to clean that off. I had to reposition my jack to put pressure on this lower control arm and get it high enough to get the upper ball joint in there. Now it's just a matter of tightening up the nuts and putting the cotter pins back in. And when you tighten up the nuts, you don't ever want to, if you can't line up with the hole on the cotter pin with your castle nut, you don't ever want to back it off to hit the hole. You always want to go a little bit further. So it's a good idea not to get it super tight until you get ready to line up your hole for your pin. That way you may have to tighten it up just a little bit more. Well, I didn't quite beat the rain, so it's a little noisy in the background. I apologize again. But I've got my castle nuts tightened down, my cotter pins folded over, and everything lined up good. So now it's just a matter of putting the brake caliper back on, shooting everything with some grease, and this side will be done. I still got to do the other side, but I'm not going to worry about doing any video on it. Well, hopefully that's answered any questions you might have about doing upper and lower ball joints on your Squarebody. Now this is for the C series, which is 2-wheel drive. It also, pretty much same thing on the 3/4 and 1 tons, so not a big deal there. Hopefully you've got a better ball joint press than what I've got to make your job a little bit easier. Mine I had to kind of mess around with a little bit because it's spread out. The other thing I'd like to add is make sure you take your truck down to, or it's a good idea to take your truck and have it realigned once you get your new ball joints in, just to make sure everything's where it's supposed to be. There may be a little bit of difference in the new ball joints versus the old ones, so it'd be a good time to go have it realigned. Anyways, that's pretty much all I've got. If you have any more questions about what's going on here, just hit me up down in the comments below, and hopefully between me or somebody else we might get your questions answered. So until next time, y'all keep your square bodies rolling, and we will catch you later.